our distinguished speaker will get into more details on forming TAs for other reasons and on all of the incredible things that TAs can do. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Amber Gruner. She is a luminary over at Housing Counseling Services, which is an extremely important agency in the city. You might have heard them get a shout out earlier today from Brianne Nadeau about how important it is for them to be funded. I will say on a personal level, in my work, the amount of onus that I see them carry, it's something I would say about very few organizations in DC, but I think Housing Counseling Services is about as vital to protecting affordable housing in this city as OTA itself. Just to toot my own horn a little bit at the end, but I really do mean that. It's a wonderful organization, and Amber is the rock over there who makes things happen. So we are very lucky to have her here today to explain to us how you form a tenants association and what the heck you do with it when you have it. I'm going to be asking her questions as she presents as they occur to me. I'm also going to be looking out to you guys. If you have a question, I'll ask you to raise your hand. I'll bring the mic to you. That's for the benefit of anybody who's watching online or who needs to read the closed captioning. It's important that the mic capture our questions so that we're accessible to everybody. So with that, please let's give a hand to Ms. Gruner. Okay.
Oh.
Go right ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Amber. I work with Housing Counseling Services. More specifically, I work in the Tenant Services Department of Housing Counseling Services. Housing Counseling Services has many free programs. We help with inclusionary zoning. We help with emergency rental assistance. We have programs for people living with HIV. We have programs for people who are veterans. So if you're interested in any of those other programs, feel free to talk to me. We have a table outside. But specifically, I work with renters. And more specifically, I work with groups of renters typically. So buildings, buildings who are dealing with the same issue as a group. So tenant associations, or sometimes, tenants just working together who aren't necessarily a formal tenants association. And we work with tenants who are going through a sale of their building. Some of them are exercising their TOPA, or tenant opportunity to purchase right. Some of them are, have bad housing conditions, and we help them, organize and get a sense of what are the common, issues, how do we approach the landlord, those kinds of things. Sometimes people are facing rent increases that may be illegal, they may not be illegal, and we help them figure those kinds of things out. Sometimes tenants need attorneys. So we reach out to OTA, we reach out to Legal Counsel for the Elderly, we reach out to Bread for the City, Legal Aid, some of those places. I'm curious who we have in the room here, just so, I know some folks maybe come from co-ops, some others are in bigger apartment buildings. Could you just introduce yourself briefly and maybe say, what brought you to the session in a sentence?
Yes, my name is Willie Gilchrist, and I reside in a subsidized housing building. I'm one of the longer living persons in that building. I moved in 1976, still there, and I'm very happy to be here.
I'm Miss Jenkins. I live at 2900 Harvard Street, Northwest. And I love it where I love where I live at. It just get along with the peoples and everything else.
Yeah.
It's just my home I live in.
Nice.
And I love it.
My name is Lisa James Brewington. I do live, we live in the same
Okay.
building. We're at Columbia Heights Village. I am on the Tenants Board Association.
Oh, okay.
And I came
Were
here
you newly elected?
Yes.
Okay, because I was working
Yes.
with the board last year. Okay.
Yes, newly elected, and we need some help.
Okay.
We have a little group going on,
Okay.
and we need to get back on track to
Okay.
get back. I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
My name is Lighton Corberry, and I live in Ward 5, and I've been living there for over 32 years. Currently, I'm retired about 1 year now. I'm a real estate agent, and I'm trying to get back full time.
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Kelvin Bell. I'm a renter, and that's it.
Dorothy Martin, live in Cleveland Park, on co-op, here for information.
Thank you all.
So it sounds like some folks came here with specific questions and specific things, but maybe we can do a more general overview first, and then we can get more into specifics.
Yeah, so just to start with the general, maybe you can talk about what powers a tenant association has, what it can do, what can it do for its tenants, why form one?
Yeah. So this is something we talk to folks a lot about, right? Because often we'll get individual calls. They may find us from another agency, they may find us online, they've heard somebody else who's gone to Housing Counseling Services, and we'll be talking to a person, maybe they have some really bad conditions in their apartment, maybe their landlord is treating them poorly. And so first we get information specifically for them, and we say, here are your options as an individual. And then we say, is this an issue that's facing more than just you? Do you live in an entire building that's, without heat, or, has holes in the ceiling, everybody has leaks? Are people dealing with issues as a group? And if that's true, then we say, how about we set up a time, we come out to your building, and we can talk to everybody as a group? Because sometimes people don't even know that you may have neighbors who are facing the exact same issue as you. And maybe, your landlord's been derogatory towards you, but you didn't know that it was other people who were facing that same harassment. And there can be a lot of power. Like, I've seen groups of people, just sort of instantly bond over hating the landlord. And it can be really powerful. So just in general, just a feeling of camaraderie can go a long way, because you all know, facing bad housing conditions, fighting with your landlord, fighting a rent increase, those are really exhausting things to do. But if you have a group behind you, it's, you can look over to the right and say, okay, Susie's in this with me, or okay, Darrell's here too, I can keep going because they're still going. So just in terms of keeping your energy up and it just keeps spirits up when people work as a group. And then, of course, there are situations in which you have to have a tenants association. So in order to exercise your right to purchase, if there's a building up for sale, you have to have a tenants association if you're 5 units or more. So you have to, get your neighbors together. You have to make sure you have a majority of your neighbors together. You have to get incorporated, which involves filing a little bit of paperwork. You have to adopt bylaws, which is what we're here to talk about today. And you have to make sure you have structures in place. And those, especially for bigger buildings, it can be nice to have a structure to build your meetings around, to build your regular day-to-day operations around, so that it's not just, and a lot of tenant association meetings end up being this anyways, but it's not just people getting together to yell in a room. You want there to be direction, you want there to be purpose, and having a tenants association can help provide the structure that you need to make sure, what are your goals? How are you going to get there? What are you working towards?
So on the topic of tenant associations providing structure, and bylaws, of course, provide structure to tenants association, I guess I'll broadly ask, what do bylaws do? And what are they for, and what kinds of things should they govern?
Yeah.
I know it's very broad.
Yeah, so first of all, most tenant associations end up adopting bylaws, first and foremost, because they're required to by law. So if you're going through the purchase and sale process, or your building's up for sale, you're going through TOPA, then you're required you have to form a corporation, which is your tenants association, and that corporation has to have bylaws. So most people don't show up and say, I just can't wait to have bylaws. It's usually that they're required to have them. But the benefit that they provide, like I said, is that they're sort of the backbone of your organization. So it's sort of a roadmap. It's not how does every single thing get done. It's here are certain, it's sort of the spine of your organization to say, okay, here's the minimum of what we have to do to make a decision. Here's who has to be in the room. These are sort of the balances of powers. That's a big one that I would love to talk about more. balancing the power of the membership, so the people who aren't on the board with the people who are on the board, so that you don't have all of the power concentrated in the hands of a few people. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I got one question.
Oh, let's wait for the mic.
Why, some people don't go by the bylaw, but don't go by the bylaw. What you do
Yeah.
there?
Do you want me to
They don't
answer
go
that?
along with it.
Yeah. So what happens when you're not following your roadmap?
Yeah.
There's a few different things you can do. I mean, obviously, if you notice that your tenant association isn't following the bylaws, well, first of all, I guess I would just want to recommend that bylaws should never be used as a weapon. And I've seen the bylaws used as a weapon sometimes, and we, you know, on both sides. I've seen it used as a weapon against the membership. I've seen it used by the membership against the board. So bylaws should never be used as a weapon, and I would never, you know, let's say there's somebody that you don't like, and you just take it as an issue to say, well, they're not following the bylaws.
Yeah.
That's not what we want to use the bylaws for, right? But if somebody's not following the bylaws and it's really impacting the way that things are affecting the membership, that's when it's an issue, right?
Fighting with each one, but fighting against one another.
So-
Yeah, well, fighting against one another is not necessarily against your bylaws. You can have a lot of fighting, and it can be well within the bylaws. But I would say, you know, first and foremost, I would address it with the person that you believe is responsible, right? So if it's, you know, if you think it's the president of the tenants association, if it's the treasurer, if it's somebody else, I would address it with them directly and say, listen, you know, I'm familiar with the bylaws. Here's what I think it says. This doesn't seem to fit into that. I would address it with them directly and ask them to respond, because I think, you know, just as in life, it's better to just go ahead and address it personally. Outside of that, I would say, you know, address the member that they, you know, the body that they belong to. So then you could go to the board at large and say, listen, you know, here's where I think this should be, or if it's the board going to the membership, that kind of thing. And then after that, you know, there are technical assistants like myself who can, you know, provide some insight. Sometimes you may need to seek help from an attorney.
And I can say from an attorney's
Yeah.
perspective that if it does come to the point where you're talking about going to court over violations of the bylaws, and to be clear, like Amber was saying, that's not people are being uncivil in meetings, that's people are not following the procedures. It's not very different actually from a shareholder suing a corporation for not following its rules. Generally, first of all, you have a duty to take it all the way to the top of the TA before you go running to court. If you are incorporated, you know, under DC law like you did it for TOPA, the Attorney General has oversight of all nonprofits in the city. That includes the AG. Did I say something
No, you
else?
said it.
Yeah, the Attorney General, the Office of the Attorney General, the OAG has oversight over that. And as a last resort, you can go to court and you can file something called a derivative suit, which is a suit where you say, I as a member am having my rights violated because the procedures aren't being followed. That's a mess of a suit. Those are long, expensive suits. But I just wanted you to know that is an option, though I would much more recommend that you call Amber or someone, a technical assistant, to come in and try to assist in an informal manner, because doing it through the courts is a mess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With the Inspector General, that's who I was trying to correct you on. But I may be incorrect in even going in that direction with the Inspector General. So would the, let me get my thoughts together here. The Racine his title is what again? Attorney General. Attorney General for the District of Columbia. But he only represents governmental bodies. He doesn't represent individuals.
So, so the Office of the Attorney General, it does represent the government. It's also one of our prosecutors in town. And one of the things that it says in the Nonprofit Corporations Act is that the Attorney General oversees it. So
So he would be the point person to contact.
he'd be the next person to go to before court. In fact, before you're allowed to go to court to sue a nonprofit, you have to go to the Attorney General, or the court won't even take the case.
Okay, we definitely, we definitely need your services because it's getting to the point the president is now going to court because one of the non-members, which was voted off by our bylaws, is actually taking the president to court. There's some attention needs to be done about it.
Yep. I'm somewhat familiar with your situation.
Okay.
I did work at Columbia Heights. I worked with the tenant association when you all were going through sort of the TOPA process and
Right.
moving to a new owner.
Right.
I will just be frank with you all. We cannot get involved in every situation where it's tenants versus tenants. And that's going to be, you're going to hear that all across the city because it's, you know, at the end of the day, a lot of it is just conflict resolution. We can provide some support. I will be honest that I think specifically with your building, we may not be able to get involved just due to some of our past involvement there. But we can absolutely talk on the phone.
Okay, because, well, basically, as a member, I mean, even on the board, there were some actions that were done that should not have happened, that governs into fraud, misappropriation of funds,
Yeah.
that type of thing. Whereas if, my opinion, the Office of Attorney General needs to be involved.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
But, you know, and then it's like a tug of war. Now management is not recognizing either one of us. So it's like cutting us off, the actual members, you know, that was voted on.
Yeah.
You know, we're getting a hard time because we can't even get some of the issues done
Yeah.
in reference to what the tenants actually need, and that's holding us up in reference to trying to comply with
Yeah.
our bylaws.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why I was saying we need some help.
We should talk. Yeah, we should talk. You know, after the meeting, I have 3 whole cards here. I did not come prepared today, but I can give everybody my phone number. But I'd be happy to. And Paul has my card. I don't know if you. Yeah, I know Paul. But I guess I just want to reiterate that in situations where, you know, yours is not the only building I know of where there's more than one tenants association. Neither wants to cede power. Both think they're right. They're unwilling to really come to the you know, maybe one side is willing to come to the table, the other isn't. Those are not situations in which the bylaws are typically going to solve anything. The only reason the bylaws are going to solve that is if you go to court. And like Sean said, that's a really messy, expensive, sometimes long, drawn out, and exhausting. It's hard on you as a person to go through that process. But yeah, so again, I think that a lot of these things have to be handled in sort of a conflict mediation way.
Right.
But, you know, I'm happy to look into it. I know there are free mediation services in the city.
Yeah, because we're actually in the process of going to
Okay.
court.
Mm-hmm.
We do have an attorney, but to me, and this is my opinion, it should never be. None of this.
Oh, can we give her the mic back?
None of this should. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're the same way that you were. Okay.
We'll talk.
All right.
Which raises.
Hold on. We have somebody in the back here.
Yes, I got a question for you, maybe to help the young lady and most of everybody here. If you're unhappy with your tenant association, create your own second tenant association.
Oh, gosh.
I think they've already done that.
Or make it a third. If you get the majority, you'll still control.
Okay, let me respond to that. Please don't do that. Please don't do that. That's how these situations get started. Yeah.
Okay,
It's,
okay.
yeah.
Look, listen,
So if there is,
It's like throwing gasoline on a fire.
so if there is an existing tenants association in your building, if they're active. Now, it's one thing if you had a tenant association 15 years ago, they've never met, everybody who was involved moved away, passed away, those kinds of things. Forming a new tenants association makes sense. But if you have a somewhat active tenants association that if in any way, you know, seems to be a legitimate tenants association, it's much better down the road. It may feel good in the moment. I believe you that it feels good in the moment to get your people on your side and
okay,
have your tenants association.
okay.
But I think it makes more sense to just
We're gonna hop on.
work within the framework that you have. I wouldn't recommend it.
I had a certain person in your same seat said if you have no options, you let me know other options.
Yeah. I'm not that person, and I would say don't do it, because what ends up happening is what she was exactly saying, which is that management and ownership don't recognize either, and so you lose all your power. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Let's move on to another question, guys.
Now, look, listen, there's a step that you need to take before you go to the Attorney General, first line of complaint.
Oh, in terms of complaining about
Like the person on at-large on the board. There's some step that you need to take before you go up to the Attorney General. So would you explain that, please? What we need to do before we get to that level?
I will, yeah. So, what steps do you need to take before you go to the Attorney General? Particularly if you are on the board, then you owe a duty to the Tenants Association of loyalty, which means you have to escalate it as high as you can within the Tenants Association before you go running to the Attorney General. So that does not mean that you have to wait and wait and wait for them to deal with your problems, but you do have to go to the president, go to the treasurer, go as high as you can to the board and say there's a problem, and then if you get shut down, you can go. If you don't, particularly if you're on the board, there could be a question of some legal exposure for you, but I don't want to get way too in the weeds on that because it's kind of outside the question of bylaws and their use.
Have a complaint with someone on the board, you need to take those steps. They're not gonna talk to you unless you go through this first, second, step.
Well, I'm not saying the OAG won't talk to you if you haven't escalated it to the board. The OAG might well talk to you. The problem is if you haven't taken those steps, the other side might say, well, you've also done something improper because you didn't try to solve it within the group first. But again, that's only if you've got an incorporated one that's registered with the city and if you've got a duty to them. So it's a little individual. So do we have other questions for Amber on bylaws?
We'll come back to you next.
Two questions. First one, suppose you've got an organization incorporated that has existed for 10, 12, many years, and they have just totally ignored the bylaws. In fact, probably have lost copies and aren't even sure where the bylaws are.
Mm-hmm.
But they've just been running it on a shoestring, and it's been existing, and mainly because maybe of one dominant person at a time running things.
Mm-hmm.
How does that affect the power of the bylaws and the remedies?
Well, I will say that if you don't know what the bylaws are, then your bylaws aren't too powerful. And if you're in a situation where you've, and we do see this, where there's been a tenants association, incorporated or not, that at one point adopted bylaws and now no longer, they may have lost the copy, they don't know where it is. At that point, you should probably adopt new bylaws, and you're going to want to use, there's something called quorum. I don't know if everybody here is familiar with the word quorum, but it means the number of people you have to have in a room, the number of, to spell it, Quorum, quorum. And it's the minimum number of members you have to make a decision. Now, if you lost your bylaws a long time ago, you're probably going to need to go with what the nonprofit corporation statute says, which is that your quorum is 50%. So if you don't know what your quorum is, you should probably have 50% of the people, of the members in the room to readopt bylaws. Alternatively, this is the only situation in which I'm recommending this, you may need to come together and form a new tenants association. It can be made up of the same people, so not two different groups. The same group can form a new tenants association, and that new group can adopt new bylaws and have new rules that they're going by. I will say that, I know plenty of tenants associations that operate just fine without once glancing at their bylaws because they work well together, they make decisions together, there's a lot of transparency. We were talking about that earlier. You can make things work without necessarily referencing your bylaws for every single decision. Now, I say that only for groups that are not necessarily involved in a legal matter. If you're not involved in now if you're in TOPA, if you're going through the sale of your building, you absolutely need to follow your bylaws, look at them day and night. Now, if you're going through something a little more informal, like a dispute with your management company over the hours that the office is open, or trying to get better security, or those kinds of day-to-day things, you don't necessarily have to. In order to have a good functioning tenants association, you don't always have to. Your bylaws could be down a drain somewhere, and you could be perfectly fine.
Okay, the other question, as you know, at least in DC and probably throughout the states, but some landlords are infamous for having agents on the board of tenant association, people who report to them. And in many cases, a number of people in tenant associations report they have been approached and whether offered a discount for rent or whatever if they will work for the owner, and either just to report what the tenant association is doing, just so the owner will know what's going on, or in some cases to influence and to vote in a way that the owner wants. Is the best way for the rest of us who are not agents of the landlord to ensure that other people, and by the way, these landlords usually go for the president or vice president, they go for as high and as strong of a person as possible. Is the best thing to do is to add to the bylaws that any person who accepts either membership in the organization or membership on the board agrees that it's a conflict of interest to be working for the landlord under penalty of whatever? Or should the bylaws include an oath, or say that the board members and officers will take an oath of allegiance to the tenants and say that they're not working? What's the best solution to this influence?
So this is something I've seen happen quite a bit, and honestly, if we should probably have a whole nother session that's brainstorming ways to keep the landlord from infiltrating the tenants association. But I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and how the bylaws can affect this. I will say that I know tenants associations where there are people in the membership and people who are on the board who work for management. Maybe they don't work on that property, but they work, if it's a big management company, they may work on a different property, but for the same management company. And I've seen those people be really good tenant association leaders and be really honest and straightforward and transparent. I've also seen situations where that's not true. I think it's a case-by-case basis. I think it's up to the tenants, right? So what I always tell the folks is you can absolutely put a clause in your bylaws that says no person who works for ownership or management may serve on the board. I wouldn't ban them from membership. That would be sort of a drastic move. But because they're one vote, right? They're not, and anybody can influence anybody. You don't have to be in the membership to influence someone. So I think, there are tenant associations who ban people who work for ownership or management, and but that has to be decided by the membership. It's up to the members to decide. Because I know of at least one tenant association where their president works for the management company and they love her, and I doubt they would ever put that in their bylaws because it works for them. But if it's not working for you, then it might make sense to make that change. One limit I would say is to make sure that the people who work for management are never a majority, right? So if you're in a pretty small building, if you're, 6 units, you have a tenant association, there shouldn't be 4 people who work for management, on the board or something like that. Or if you have a 5-person board, you shouldn't have 3 people working for management or working for ownership. So you want to make sure you limit the power that the votes that those folks might have. The oath idea is actually a pretty good one. The only thing is that with any violation of the bylaws, a violation of an oath is, something you'd have to, I don't know how you would how would you remedy that? You know, I don't really know. Maybe that's for the lawyer in the room. I think, you know, I've thought about this before. I've thought about, you know, people, when they sign up for membership, they have to say they won't, you know, I don't know. I've seen tenants get paid off to like flip tenant associations and stuff, and you can't prove that kind of thing, right? Like, without litigation, you can't prove it without litigation.
Can I cut you off for just a second?
Okay, hold on. Let's make sure you have the mic first.
Yeah, well, we got a question back here first
Okay.
from Ms. Jenkins. I just wanted to address, in addition, the question about dealing with corruption on tenants associations, and it's like any kind of political corruption. It's corruption of a democratic institution, even if it's a tiny democratic institution. It's hard to deal with. You know, people's personal sense of honor. Oaths are used not because they are enforceable, but because people raise their hand and they swear in sight of God that they'll do such, and people have consciences. You know, those are all the steps you can take. If it comes to court, it's either the tenant association suing the person saying you violated your duty of loyalty, or it's, again, a derivative suit where you're suing in the name of the tenants association saying the board has violated a duty of loyalty. And either way, it's complicated and it's tough to prove. Well, but it's more complicated than a normal lawsuit, because before you can even get to the part where there's a trial, you have to have a little mini trial about whether you are authorized to sue on the corporation's behalf. So it's a long process, but it can be done. You file it at Civil Actions Branch.
Do you file it going to Department of Housing?
No, you go to Superior Court and you file it in Civil Actions Branch. Well, no, first you go to the Attorney General, as I mentioned.
I got one more question to ask you.
Okay.
And the 2900 where we live in, I'm gonna ask, I don't know what. I'm gonna ask, we got the key, we can get in our apartment through the front door and the back door. And we don't have no key to get into, going up to us apartment, is into another door. And we gotta wait till the guard to open the door for us to get back in us apartment. And I said to myself, now who would come a fire or something? I don't have time to run up there and get my grandbaby or nothing. We can't get into the door. Because there might not be at the front desk. Nobody should be on the front desk.
Yeah.
You know?
Well,
And I said, we should not, that's us home.
yeah.
Why they don't give us a key going up to us apartment? The ones that's come to visit, that's the one that should stop. You
Yeah.
know?
Well, I don't want to spend too much time on this because it sounds like a personal issue, but I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about it. You know, they have to be up to fire code, right? So,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
you have to have
yeah.
exits. I don't know that they have to have multiple entrances.
Yeah.
So we should talk about it though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think he's willing to allow.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Amber, you have, you're in a position where you see a great many buildings and tenant associations, and corruption, I guess, is the best word for what we're discussing with the so-called landlords influencing tenant associations. Do you, and I believe this type of corruption or influence is a tactic to, number one, take the rights away from tenants through the tenant association. And the other thing is, we were talking about, I didn't know that tenants, officers were actually working for corporations, so that was a new insight that you shared with us. But what if you have a situation where a president of a tenant association is getting gratuities, money, you know, because as I said before, money changes everything. And because the bylaws are not under enforcement, in fact, it's gotten to the point, it's been such a long period of time, most people have never seen the bylaws, they don't know the bylaws. Building I live in, we have an international community of people who are from the continent, in Africa. English is not their first language, so you throw in a cultural and a language issue. So they're sort of like, they don't really know what's going on. But if it comes from an authority figure, they believe it, but, you know, when you have officers who are running in elected positions and they're getting monies, say, for example, if you have vending machines, they get the money from the vending machines, the Coca-Cola machines, the candy machines, but nobody knows how much money they get. Nobody knows how often they get that money. Nobody even knows where they bank. Everything is secret. There's no transparency. So, you know, all we know is there is a bank account. We know where the money comes from, and they're the only ones that control those accounts.
Okay, so you mentioned a lot of stuff. I'm trying to remember all of it. So, you know, help me out if I forget something.
Cut me off because I tend to be long-winded.
So the most recent thing you mentioned is that nobody knows where the money is going, those kinds of things. Financial, I'm not a financial expert. You know, every tenant association that has any sort of funds, be it $1 dues to, you know, tens of thousands of dollars coming to the tenants association every year, has to figure out the best way to deal with that. And the best way to do it is to have, you know, everybody needs to know exactly what's happening with the money, or be able to know exactly what's happening with the money. And before you even get a cent, you should have, you know, a plan for where's the money going to go, what's the budget, who approves the budget, how, you know, what do reimbursements look like, what are approved costs, what are unapproved costs. That's upfront work you need to do. This isn't 5 years after you get $20,000 in your bank account. This is, you know, 6 months before you get any money. You should be having those conversations. Any tenants association that has funds is supposed to make their financial books available to the membership.
They don't do that.
So, you know, again, enforcement is a difficult thing. But I would say in your situation, and in a lot of these situations, you're going to have to organize your neighbors, right? You're going to have to talk to your neighbors and see if they also think this is an issue, because an army of one isn't going to get very far, right? If you have the majority of the membership saying, wait a second, I didn't realize they were getting money from the vending machines. How much money is that? You know, should they be getting that money, or should that money be going to scholarships or programs for kids or seniors or things like that? You know, at some point you're going to have to maybe knock on some doors, or, you know, maybe you have coffee with some people to see who else in the building, because I'm sure you're not the only person. If that many units, you're not the only person who has an issue with it. And can you create a large enough voice for this to be, you have to force them to deal with it, right? You have to make yourselves loud enough and important enough for them to want to talk to you.
When you have management stifling those types.
Okay, so let me talk about that. Okay, so I will say across the board, you can have the nicest landlord in the world, you can have the meanest landlord in the world. What they have in common is they all like docile, easy to deal with tenants associations. So whatever they can do to make it easier for, you know, landlords say, even landlords that say, we like working with tenants associations. That can be absolutely true. I do know landlords who enjoy working with tenants, who like the relationship they have with the tenants association. They don't like tenant associations that always hold them accountable, right? So, but that's up to the membership, right? That's up to you and your neighbors to make sure that this body that's been created to speak for you, this tenants association, because that's what it is. It's a union, right? And these are your union reps. And if they're going to the bosses, you want them to be speaking for you. But that's where you really have to do your groundwork. It's not always going to happen in those tenant association meetings. You may have to, you know, start having those conversations among each other to make sure that the voices of the majority are heard. And I will say that even well-meaning people on boards, being on the board of a big tenants association, it's a lot of work. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons that you shouldn't get paid for it. But it's a part-time job. You know, I know people who are heads of tenant associations of 500 unit properties. You know how many people that is that have your phone number? That's a lot of people calling you all times a day, emailing you with all kinds of issues. They have a lot of work on their plate. And so even the best meaning ones may not always have time or energy to make sure that everybody is the most informed. Or they may not, you know, it's like politicians. They may not know exactly what is the pulse of the people in the building that they live with.
I just want to make some comments. possibly make a piggyback on what you are saying. In an organization or tenant association, I believe you do have a treasurer, and you do hold meetings. You can get to a point if your treasurer is making a quarterly report or whatever, you have the right to ask questions about where the money is going. And you have to talk to people that believe in you too. Make a motion that you want the treasurer or the association to make available where the money for the vending machine is going. Who owns the vending machine? How much do they normally make on this vending machine, monthly or weekly or whatever? If you have enough people to be on your side,
Asking those exact questions. In fact, I've written a letter, I've written several letters to the president, the board, the management company, even the resident services. And the owner, the third-party ownership, kicks it back to the president to answer it. And of course, she's not going to answer it.
So I'll just emphasize what Amber said, which is ultimately, if what we're talking about is the corruption of a democratic body, there are ways to fight about that in the courts, as we have seen the last few years. But the best way is to vote and to get other people to vote. To paraphrase our former president, don't complain, vote. If your tenants association is corrupt, you get people who are not, and you vote them. That's the best way, as far as I know.
So let me respond specifically to one thing that you said, which is, I don't know if everybody here is familiar with motions and passing motions and things like that. You know, people get really caught up in parliamentary procedure and Robert's rules. I don't deal with any of that. I do motions, I do seconds, and I do let's vote on the motion. And that's really as simple as you need, and you need somebody just taking notes of who said what and what the vote was. But what you said was really important, which is, you know, you said that you've written letters and those kinds of things. But again, if you really want to make change, you have to have these decisions in a group. So, you know, next time you're at a tenant association meeting, you can make a motion. You can say, you know, I make a motion that we have these records available to everyone, you know, via email or something like that, or, you know, posted publicly or something like that. And then you have to have the majority of people there who support you. And sometimes it happens in the meeting, and sometimes you have to do some groundwork before you can get that support. We should talk more. Yeah. We have,
Amber, is there anywhere your organization or your location there's information on bylaws that we go online to?
so we don't have any online. If you want, I can provide you with my information, and we can chat more about bylaws. We have sort of a template that we work from.
Is there any way we can get a copy of that template?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
absolutely. I can email it to you, or send it to you in the mail. Yeah.
Okay.
Because we don't have elections. We haven't had an election in 10 years.
That's bad right there.
They're crooked.
You need election every year.
Everybody's quiet. They don't say anything. They won't do
You gotta
anything.
talk to your
I'm a
neighbors
lone
that
wolf
on your
talking.
side.
Yeah.
Everybody by themselves.
They're tired of me, so.
So,
So-
if you're not holding elections, it can't just be one person calling for elections, right? It's got to be a big group of people calling for elections and making sure that your bylaws should say you have elections every year, every 2 years.
Yeah.
Okay, every 2
But they've
years.
been there 10 years.
Yeah,
So what's wrong? So what's going on?
yeah.
So,
I'm at a loss, so.
so going back to the topic of bylaws, can I ask you generally, what are some of the most important things to put in your bylaws? I know you've got a template. Maybe you can run us through a couple of the things that are in the template and why you put them in there.
So, you know, first of all, you have to decide who can be a member. You know, some tenant associations automatically make everybody who lives there a member. I don't really like to do that. I don't recommend that, because you want to make sure whoever is a member are going to be the active people, right? So you maybe want to have them have to sign up in writing that they want to be a member. Another thing to include is, like we talked about earlier, that word quorum. So, you know, it's one thing to have your membership, but if you have a 50-person membership, but you only have 2 people coming to meetings, those 2 people probably shouldn't be making all the decisions, right? Even if other people aren't coming to the meetings, you want to make sure you set your quorum so that maybe you have to have 15 people in the room to make a meeting, because that's a bigger percentage of the decision makers who have to actually care about the issue and show up to vote on it. So you want to make sure you set a quorum. You don't want to set it at 50, because Are you ever going to get all your members in a room? No, you're probably not. But you want to make sure you set it high enough to where it's a little bit of a stretch. So you actually have to talk to people, make sure they're interested in the issue. Maybe it's an election, maybe it's voting on your TOPA rights, maybe it's voting to send a letter to the landlord about conditions. Maybe you're hiring a lawyer, those kinds of things. You have to talk to people to make sure they're interested and reach that number, but you don't want it to be too low so that, again, you have 3 people in a room making decisions for 50. So define your membership, who's a member, how do they say that they're a member, quorum. We talked a little bit about elections, so you want to make sure you have regular elections included in there. Some people brought up financial affairs. You want to make sure that there's something in there about the ability of the membership to inspect the financial books at request. Now, you don't necessarily want to have the financial books right up front where you come and sign in and everybody can just look through and see who's paid dues. That wouldn't really be appropriate. But if a member, has a reasonable request to see the records, you want to include that. And then another big one is the powers of membership. So a lot of people have a misconception that the board makes all the decisions and the members don't have a say. And all they can do is come and say their opinions, but it doesn't matter. It's really important to define what decisions does the membership only get to make. So these are decisions that the board can't just have a meeting and make decisions behind closed doors. These are decisions that are what to do with your TOPA rights, who to sell the building to, trying to think, amending your bylaws, adopting your bylaws. Those are things that the members get to decide on. So, big decisions should really be decided by the membership. Now, there are some small decisions you do want your board to make some decisions without the membership because, Columbia Heights Village, 400 units, you just can't be getting all those people together to make really small decisions, right? So you might need to, extend a deadline, and the board can take a vote to extend a deadline. But for bigger decisions like, what's the future of your building look like, those need to be defined in the membership powers.
Yeah, Amber, that's a very good question because, that's a very good question because when we partied up with the current nonprofit third party, the understanding was that the agreement, which none of us were privy to see, including the executive board, because the president said that the documents were for her eyes only.
Okay.
It's kind of Jane Bondishly, a phrase. And so nobody's seen those. And I said that to say this, what we heard through the grapevine about those documents was that the agreement would end in 2020, which is right around the corner. And where I live on 14th Street, the real estate is going through the roof. And periodically I see white men with smartphones taking pictures of the building. I don't think they're architecture students. Maybe, I don't know. It's a
good-looking building.
It's a nice building. I've lived there since 1976.
Yeah.
But money changes everything. So I'm under the impression that in 2020, if the tenants in my building don't educate themselves to their rights, another issue is whenever the third-party people come, they say this is their building. We own this building. I'd like if you could explain the TOPA relationship. I thought it was a partnership, but whenever the third-party people come in, it's always, they're always saying this is our building, meaning management. So what ownership, if any, do the tenants actually have in properties under TOPA?
So.
Sorry for being long.
That's okay. That's good. That's a good question.
So, in terms of the relationship of a tenants association and an owner after TOPA, that's really defined during the process. So you have a whole period of time that you have to negotiate with whoever's going to buy the building.
We don't sell the documents.
So that's a different issue, and we should talk about your situation specifically. But it can sometimes be, a lot of the situations that we see is tenants associations choosing who's going to own the building. So it is a partnership in the sense that they make an agreement. So you may say, I choose, you know, company A to buy the building. In exchange, they agree to these things, and it may be, you know, rent protections. It may be a better management company. It may be a playground on the property, and that's, you know, that's the partnership that exists. It's not necessarily an ownership partnership, but it's a partnership in the sense that they have responsibilities in taking care of the building, and you have, you know, and you have your responsibility in terms of allowing, you know, giving them the right to own the building. And in terms of having access to a development agreement or an agreement between the tenants association and, you know, and the owner, that's something that, you know, members should be able to request. I'll be honest, we probably have a copy somewhere, so we can see about that. And I'll guarantee you that if we may have a copy of that somewhere.
Yeah, I'd like to see that, because we don't know.
But in the event,
2020 is
so
what's gonna
let's say that 2020 rolls around, these white men with smartphones come through and they say, we want to buy the building. You still have TOPA rights. You still have the right to do exactly what happened 10, 15 years ago, to get your tenant association in order, maybe do some reshuffling of the board, and to, you know, to make a new agreement with maybe the smartphone guys, maybe some other folks that you want to work with.
Okay, we're going to have time for just one or two more questions because we're running short on time. Here we go.
Okay, my question is, I'm gonna go back to the bylaws. Okay, every tenant association should have their bylaws registered by whom?
Farm and Regulatory Affairs, right?
DCRA?
It depends. It depends on if your building is going through, needs, you know, depends on what your building needs. If your building is going through some sort of legal matter, it might be TOPA, you may be in court for housing conditions, there may be some other reason that you have to have those things on file. You would, when you incorporate, file a copy with, that would be the initial incorporation with DCRA. There would be a copy of the bylaws there. And they should always have a copy on hand. But, you know, we work with tenants associations that never filed their bylaws with anyone other than their own organization because they have no reason to. You don't always have to, you know, be incorporated in order to be considered a legitimate tenants association.
Okay, but legally, you know, say if I'm a tenant and I wanna go and I requested several times to get a copy of my bylaws, okay? And only to find that my bylaws was never or was submitted to DCRA, which is ours have. Okay, we went under TOPA, we went under new management, the whole 9 yards. But when it comes down to if it's on file, okay, and we even had a class in reference to bylaws. Okay, so it's not as if people don't know what's what. We understand, we know, okay, but to hide the information for 10 years, that doesn't sound like that they're abiding by their bylaws. So what can a tenant do in reference to, okay, we know that DC Office of Tenants Advocacy has our best interests at heart, the tenants. So if we come to you and to ask you, well, we need you to get a copy of the bylaws, or how could we go about retrieving a copy?
Yeah,
You know what I mean? It should be somewhere. Where is it legally?
right.
And how can we go about retrieving it?
Yeah, Paul should have a copy of your bylaws.
No, I trust, I have
Okay.
a copy of my old bylaws, I have a copy of my new bylaws, but what I'm hearing is they don't have access.
Yeah.
And
So
it's
just
like-
in general, where might you,
Right.
how do you get a copy of your
Right,
bylaws?
right, 'cause see, I
Yep.
trust and believe.
Yeah.
I'm not the type of tenant that I'm gonna sit around and, okay, you're not gonna give me the copy, okay, but I'm gonna go about and try to find a copy, because I'm gonna come to you guys.
Yeah. I would say go, you know, obviously go to the board first. They should absolutely have a copy. If for whatever reason the board isn't providing you with a copy, see if the board had any technical assistance when they created their bylaws. So a lot of tenant associations either work with OTA, Housing Counseling Services, LEDC, Other, there may be other organizations out there who are helping tenant associations form and create these bylaws. I would say reach out to those folks. Say, oh, I know they worked with Amber back in such and such year. Let's see if she's still there. Let's see if they have a copy. Outside of that, again,
Yeah, but what I was asking the question for the entire whole.
Sure,
Because I was
yeah.
hearing a lot of people saying
Uh-huh.
that, okay, they didn't have it for 10 years,
Mhm.
but that should be, it's other areas.
Right.
You know what I mean? And even if they're hiding it, how could you go about getting it?
yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
Property manager should have it if you have one.
No.
Well,
No.
not really. Property manager doesn't need to have a copy of her bylaws. I wouldn't want them to.
You would want them to have a copy.
We got another question over here.
I have a quick question before we do your raffle and get your report cards. I know a few people in here, and I'm going to ask this question, and maybe it's good Joel is here as well. What do seniors do if their building is pretty much dedicated or supposedly dedicated to be a senior residence? And when people pass away or have to move to a facility, the landlord does not replace them with seniors, but replaces them with young families, frequently with children. What do the tenants do?
So, that's a little outside of the scope, but I
Yeah.
think,
It's
Yeah.
Where would they at least call or write to?
So in terms of where to call or write to, just because it's a very quick answer, if you've got that situation that you described, call AARP, Legal Counsel for the Elderly, or call us. Call us over at OTA to talk about that more in detail.
if it is a senior building and it's dedicated for seniors and they're receiving, city funds or some other sort of subsidy, there should be a covenant on the building. There should be something that governs, is it senior restricted, is it not? It may be that the majority of people who live there happen to be seniors, but it's not necessarily restricted for seniors.
But if it's like Section 202, which I believe is a federal senior program, which I believe is run through DC Housing Authority, they also have a grievance procedure for
Okay.
violations of programs.
Sure.
So you should
Okay.
be able to have recourse to either DCHA or HUD.
I know a few people that are in here that have that issue
Okay.
and are very shy about bringing it up, so I figured I'd bring it up for them.
And a lot of people have died and nobody know, it stayed at 3 or 4 days, but they don't know if they're dead or not.
Yeah.
So I just want to say, it's 4:15. It's the time that we were scheduled to end. Now, I realize we started 15 minutes late because the lunch ran late. So I'm happy to stay and continue talking for another 15 minutes. But if anybody needs to go, don't feel shy about that you're leaving in the middle of the session, because we are technically done here. And I think that we want to have
You're ready
some
for the
time to
raffle?
do the raffle. We ready to raffle? Are you ready for the white-knuckled excitement of a raffle? Okay, all right, let's raffle. Let's do that.
Okay, everybody get your